Hi, welcome to Chapter 5, Part 2 of The Toil of Trace and Trail. And where we left off in the story, you had Buck now has new owners, Hal, Charles, and Mercedes, who are completely inexperienced and definitely not reliable and have no idea what they're doing. So, as we read, one of the things to look at is the impact on Buck's life when he's put with owners who have really little to no idea how to live on the trail. All right. Late next morning, Buck led the long team up the street. There was nothing lively about it, no snap or go in him, and his fellows, they were starting dead weary. 4 times he had covered the distance between Saltwater and Dawson, and the knowledge that, jaded and tired, he was facing the same trail once more made him bitter. His heart was not on the work, nor was the heart of any dog. The outsiders were timid and frightened, and the insides without confidence in their masters. I apologize. So the outsides are the dogs on the outside of the team, and they're timid, and the insides or the inside dogs are not confident that anybody knows what they're doing. So they have no faith in the people in charge, and they don't respect them. Buck felt vaguely that there was no depending upon these two men and the woman, and they did not know how to do anything. And as the days went by, it became apparent that they could not learn. They were slack in all things, without order or discipline, and it took them half the night to pitch a slovenly camp and half the morning to break that camp and to get the sled loaded and fashioned so slovenly that for the rest of the day they were occupied in stopping and rearranging the load. Some days they did not make it 10 miles, and on other days they were unable to get started at all. And on no day did they succeed in making more than half the distance used by the men as a basis in their dog food computation. The word inevitable is unavoidable. So you're going to see that the dogs, because they're conditioned to eat a certain amount of food, the rationings that Mercedes comes out with and Charles and Hal isn't going to be enough for any of them. So at this point, it's going to be inevitable that they're going to starve to death if something isn't rectified. It was inevitable that they should go short on dog food, but they hastened it by overfeeding, bringing the day nearer when underfeeding would commence. The outside dogs, whose digestions had not been trained by chronic famine to make the most of the little, had voracious appetites. I apologize. The outside dogs are actually the dogs who were not trained in sled dog training. I got confused that in that last earlier paragraph. So they're the ones that have to eat the most because they're not used to the trail. The inside dogs are the ones who had always been on the trail, like Buck and his friends who have experience. And when, in addition to this, the worn-out huskies pulled weakly, Hal decided that the orthodox ration was too small. He doubled it, and to cap it all, when Mercedes, with tears in her eyes and a quaver in her throat, could not cajole him into giving the dogs still more, she stole from the fish sacks and fed them slyly. But it was not the food that Buck and the huskies needed, but rest. Hold on one second. And though they were making poor time, the heavy load they dragged sapped their strength severely. So they're not traveling as far as they had been, but they're carrying more weight, so it's making them more tired. Then came the underfeeding. Hal awoke one day to the fact that his dog food was half gone and the distance only quarter covered. Further, that for the love or money, no additional dog food was to be obtained. So he cut down even the orthodox or normal ration and tried to increase the day's travel. His sister and brother-in-law seconded him, but they were frustrated by their heavy outfit and their own incompetence. It was a simple matter to give the dogs less food, but it was impossible to make the dogs travel faster while their own inability to get underway earlier in the morning prevented them from traveling longer hours. Not only did they not know how to work dogs, but they did not know how to work themselves. The first to go was Dub. Poor blundering thief that he was, always caught and getting punished, he had nonetheless been a faithful worker. His wrenched shoulder blade, untreated and unrested, went from bad to worse, till Hal finally shot him with the big Colt's revolver. It is a saying in the country that an outside dog starves to death on the ration of a husky. So the 6 outside dogs under Buck could do no less than die on half the ration of a husky. The Newfoundland went first, followed by the 3 short-haired pointers and the 2 mongrels, hanging more grittily on to life, but going in the end. So now these outside dogs are dying because they cannot survive on the limited amount of food, which means there's even less dogs to pull the weight, although there's less dogs to eat the food. By this time, the amenities of the gentleness of the Southland had fallen away from from the 3 people. Shorn of its glamour and romance, Arctic travel became to them a reality too harsh for their manhood and womanhood. Mercedes ceased weeping over the dogs, being too occupied with weeping over herself and with quarreling with her husband and brother. To quarrel was the one thing they were never too weary to do. Quarrel means fight. Their irritability arose out of their misery, increased with it, doubled upon it, outdistanced it, and the wonderful patience of the trail which comes to men who toil hard and suffer sore, and remain sweet of speech and kindly, did not come to these 2 men and the women. They had no inkling of such patience. They were stiff and in pain. Their muscles ached, their bones ached, and their hearts ached, and because of this, they became sharp. Sorry. Oh no. Hold on one second. Sorry, the whole screen rose up because of this kitten. Let me find where we left off. Here we go. By this time, all the amenities and gentleness of the Southland had fallen away from the 3 people. That's where I was. So let me skip down to the bottom. Here we go. They had no inkling of such patience. They were stiff and in pain, and their muscles ached, and their bones ached, and their very hearts ached. And because of this, they became sharp of speech, and hard words were first on their lips in the morning and last night. Charles and Hal wrangled whenever Mercedes gave them a chance. It was a cherished belief that one did more than his share of the work, and neither forbore to speak this belief at every opportunity. Sometimes Mercedes sided with her husband, and sometimes with her brother. The result was a beautiful and unending family quarrel or fight, starting from a dispute as to which should chop a few sticks or as to who should chop a few sticks for the fire, a dispute which concerned only Charles and Hal, presently would be lugged into the rest of the family. Fathers, mothers, uncles, cousins, people thousands of miles away, and some of them dead. Then Hal's views on art or the sort of society plays his mother's brother wrote should have anything to do with the chopping of a few sticks of firewood past his comprehension. Nevertheless, the quarrel was as likely to tend the direction of Charles's political prejudices, and that Charles's sister's tale-bearing tongue should be relevant in the building of a Yukon fire was apparent only to Mercedes, who disburdened herself of copious opinions upon that topic, and incidentally upon a few other traits unpleasantly peculiar to her husband's family. In the meantime, the fire remained unbuilt, the camp half pitched, and the dogs unfed. So at this point, they're low on supplies, everything's really stressful, and they're constantly just fighting. They're fighting about things in the past. You know, when family gets together and you bring up, oh, Uncle so-and-so always said you were lazy, or my mother's cooking was the best, whatever. They're getting into these kind of bizarre fights about family that have nothing to do with the chores and the work that they need to do. Mercedes nursed a special grievance, the grievance of sex. So here, this is the part where she's going to use the fact that she's a woman to her advantage and insist that she can't help with some of the more, quote, manly kind of tasks. Mercedes nursed a special grievance, the grievance of sex. She was pretty and soft and had been chivalrously treated all her days. Like, that means treated like a princess. But the present treatment by her husband and brother was anything save chivalrous. It was her custom to be helpless. They complained, upon which impeachment of what to her was her most essential sex prerogative, she made their lives unendurable. She no longer considered the dogs, and because she was sore and tired, she persisted in riding on the sled. She was pretty and soft, but she weighed 120 pounds. A lusty last straw to the load dragged by the weak and starving animals. She rode for days till they fell in the traces and the sled stood still. Charles and Hal begged her to get off and walk, pleaded with her, entreated or begged, and while she wept and importuned heaven with a recital of their brutality. So she just keeps whining and complaining. And to not like top things off, she's throwing herself on top of the sled, which means there's even more weight for the sled dogs to carry. On one occasion, they took her off the sled by main strength. They never did it again. She let her legs go limp like a spoiled child and sat down on the trail. They went on their way, but she did not move. And after they had traveled 3 miles, they unloaded the sled, came back for her, and by main strength, put her on the sled again. So at one point, they're so sick of it, they just throw her off and pull her off the sled, but she just stays there and refuses to move. So they eventually have to go back and pick her up again. In the excess of their own misery, they were callous to the suffering of the animals. Hal's theory, which he practiced on others, was that one must get hardened. He had started out preaching it to his sister and brother-in-law. Failing there, he hammered it into the dogs with a club. At the 5 fingers, the dog food gave out, meaning it ran out, and a toothless old squaw or Native American offered to trade them a few pounds of frozen horsehide for the Colt revolver that kept the big hunting knife company at Hal's hip. A poor substitute for food was this hide, just as it had stripped from the starved horses of the cattlemen 6 months back. In its frozen state, it was more like strips of galvanized iron, and when a dog wrestled it into his stomach, it thawed into thin and innutritious leathery strings and into a mass of short hair, irritating and indigestible. And through it all, Buck staggered along at the head of the team as in a nightmare. He pulled it when he could, and when he could no longer pull, he fell down and remained down till blows from whip or club drove him to his feet again. All the stiffness and gloss had gone out of his beautiful furry coat. The hair hung down limp and draggled or matted with dried blood where Hal's club had bruised him. His muscles had wasted away to stringy knots, and the flesh pads had disappeared so that every rib and every bone in his frame were outlined cleanly through the loose hide that was wrinkled in folds of emptiness. It was heartbreaking. Only Buck's heart was unbreakable. The man in the red sweater had proved that. As it was with Buck, so it was with his mates. They were perambulating or walking skeletons. There were 7 altogether, including him. In his very great misery, they had become insensible to the bite of the lash or the bruise of the club. The pain of the beating was dull and distant, just as the things their eyes saw and their ears heard seemed dull and distant. They were not half living or quarter living. They were simply so many bags of bones in which sparks of life fluttered faintly. And when a halt was made, they dropped down in the traces like dead dogs, and the spark dimmed and paled and seemed to go out. And when the club or whip fell upon them, the spark fluttered feebly up, and they tottered to their feet, staggered on. There came a day when Billy the good-natured fell and could not rise. Hal had traded off his revolver, so he took the axe and knocked Billy on the head as he lay in the traces, then cut the carcass out of the harness and dragged it to one side. Buck saw and his mates saw, and they knew that this was very close to them, and on the next day Kuna went, and but 5 of them remained. So at this point, the dogs cannot go on. They have no will. They can't pull the sled. Doesn't matter how much you beat them. They have no food, and they're just all giving up or they're dying. So the next day, Kuna went, and but 5 of them remained. Joe, too far gone to be malignant. Pike, crippled and limping, only half conscious and not conscious enough longer to malinger. So Lex, the one-eyed, still faithful to the toil of trace and trail, and mournful in that he had so little strength with which to pull. Teak, who had not traveled so far that winter and who was now being beaten more than the others because he was fresher, and Buck, still at the head of the team but no longer enforcing discipline or striving to enforce it, blind with weakness half the time and keeping the trail by the loom of it and by the dim feel of his feet. It was beautiful weather, but neither dogs nor humans were aware of it. Each day the sun rose earlier and set later, and it was dawn by 3 in the morning, and twilight lingered till 9 at night. The whole long day was a blaze of sunshine. The ghostly winter silence had given way to a great spring murmur of awakening life, and this murmur arose from all the land, fraught with the joy of living. It came from things that lived and moved again, things which had been dead and which had not moved during the long months of frost. The sap was rising in the pines, the willows and the aspens were bursting out in young buds, and shrubs and vines were putting on fresh garbs of green. Crickets sang in the night, and in the day all manner of creeping, crawling things rustled forth into the sun. Partridges and woodpeckers were booming and knocking in the forest, and squirrels were chattering, birds singing, and overhead honked the wild fowl driving from the south the cunning wedges that split the air. This is a beautiful description of the spring thawing. Animals are coming out. It's gorgeous. You can hear birds, you can hear frogs, you can hear all of the animal life calling. But one of the other things that happens is it's harder for the dogs to travel because this is the point where it's dangerous because the ice is melting. At this point, we're going to meet another character, and the word whittling means carving because this is what he's going to be doing. Hold on one sec. Guys, see, got this crazy kitten here. Keeps stepping on the keyboard. From every hill slope came the trickling of running water, the music of unseen fountains, and all things were thawing, bending, snapping, and the Yukon was straining to break loose the ice that's bound it down. It ate away from beneath, the sun ate from above, air holes formed, fissures sprang and spread apart, while thin sections of ice fell bodily into the river. And amid all this bursting and rending and throbbing of awakened life, under the blazing sun and through the soft sighing breezes, like wayfarers to death, staggered the two men, the women, and the huskies. With the dogs failing, Mercedes weeping and riding, Hal swearing innocuously, and Charles's eyes wistfully watering, they staggered into John Thornton's camp in the mouth of White River. When they halted, the dogs dropped down as though they had been struck by death. Mercedes dried her eyes and looked at John Thornton. Charles sat in a log to rest. He sat down very slowly and painstakingly in what was his great stiffness. Hal did the talking. John Thornton was whittling, the last touches of an axe handle that he had made from a stick of birch. He whittled and listened and gave monosyllabic replies, and when it was asked, terse or stern advice. He knew the breed, and he gave his advice in a certainty that it would not be followed. So here you have John Thornton, who's familiar with the trail. He's sitting there doing his chores, and he sees this ratty band of people with like dying animals coming his way, and he just knows from their personalities they're not going to listen to what I say. They're know-it-alls. So I'm going to be limited in what I say to them. Here I go. They told us up above that the bottom was dropping out of the trail, and the best thing for us to do was lay over, Hal said in response to Thornton's warning to take no more chances on the rotten ice or thin ice. They told us that we couldn't make White River, and here we are. This last with a sneering ring of triumph. And they told you true, John Thornton answered. The bottom's likely to drop out at any moment. Only fools with the blind luck of fools could have made it. I tell you straight, I wouldn't risk my carcass on that ice for all the gold in Alaska. That's because you're not a fool, I suppose, said Hal. And all the same, we'll go to Dawson. He uncoiled his whip. Get up there, Buck. Heat. Get up there. Mush on. Thornton went on whittling. It was idle, he knew, to go between a fool and his folly, while 2 or 3 fools, more or less, would not alter the scheme of things. But the team did not get up on command. It had long since passed into the stage where blows were required to rouse it. The whips flashed here and there on its merciless errands. John Thornton compressed his lips. When someone compresses their lips like that, it means he's like in disagreement and trying not to say anything. So Lex was the first to crawl to his feet. Teek followed. Joe came next, yelping with pain. Pike made painful efforts. Twice he fell, went half up, and on the third attempt managed to rise. Buck made no effort. He lay quietly where he had fallen. The lash bit into him again and again, but he neither whined nor struggled. Several times Thornton started as though to speak, but changed his mind. A moisture came into his eyes, and as the whipping continued, he arose and walked irresolutely up and down. So this is him kind of, do I interfere? Do I stop this? He's witnessing this severe animal abuse, so does he just stop? Or does he doesn't own the dogs, he really has no right to say anything. This was the first time Buck had failed. In itself, a sufficient reason to drive Hal into a rage. He exchanged the whip for the customary club, and Buck refused to move under the rain of heavier blows which now fell upon him. Like his mates, he barely able to get up, but unlike them, he had made up his mind not to get up. He had a vague feeling of impending doom. This had been strong upon him when he pulled into the bank and had not departed from him. Impending doom is that feeling of dread in your heart that if you follow what you're supposed to do or go or follow your plans, that something horrible is going to happen. And Buck just has this sense of death coming and he just won't move. This is the first time he's ever not moved and he just won't do it because he's afraid something really bad is going to happen. This had been strong upon him when he pulled into the bank and it had not departed from him. What of the thin and rotten ice he had felt under his feet all day, it seemed that he sensed disaster close at hand. Out there ahead on the ice, where his master was trying to drive him, he refused to stir. So greatly had he suffered, and so far gone was he, that the blows did not hurt much, and they continued to fall upon him. The spark of life within flickered and went down, and it was nearly out. He felt strangely numb, and as though from a great distance he was aware that he was being beaten. The last sensations of pain left him, and he no longer felt anything, though very faintly he could hear the impact of the club upon his body. But it was no longer his body, he seemed far away. And then suddenly, without warning, uttering a cry that was inarticulate and more the cry of an animal, John Thornton sprang upon the man who wielded the club. Hal was hurled back, and as though struck by a falling tree, and Mercedes screamed, and Charles looked on wistfully, wiped his watery eyes, but did not get up because of his stiffness. John Thornton stood over Buck, struggled to control himself, too convulsed with rage to speak. "If you strike that dog again, I'll kill you," he at last managed to say in a choking voice. "It's my dog," Hal replied, wiping the blood from his mouth as he came back. "Get out of my way or I'll fix you. I'm going to Dawson." Thornton stood between him and Buck and evinced no intention of getting out of the way. Hal drew his long hunting knife. Mercedes screamed, cried, and laughed and manifested the chaotic abandonment of hysteria. Thornton rapped Hal's knuckles with the axe handle, knocking the knife to the ground. He rapped his knuckles again as he tried to pick it up, and then he stood, picked it up himself, and with 2 strokes cut Buck's traces. Hal had no fight left in him. Besides, his hands were full of his sister and his arms, rather, while Buck was too near dead to be of further use in hauling the sled. A few minutes later, they pulled out from the bank and down the river. Buck heard them and raised his head to see. Pike was leading, so Lex was at the wheel, and between them were Joe and Teek. They were limping and staggering. Mercedes was riding the loaded sled. Hal guided at the gee pole, and Charles stumbled along in the rear. As Buck watched them, Thornton knelt beside him with his rough, kindly hands searched for broken bones, and by the time his search had disclosed nothing more than many bruises and a state of terrible starvation, the sled was a quarter of a mile away. Dog and man watched it crawling along over the ice, and suddenly they saw it back and drop down as into a rut, and the gee pole, with Hal clinging to it, jerk into the air. Mercedes' scream came back to their ears. They saw Charles turn and make one step to run back, and then a whole section of ice give way, and dogs and humans disappear. A yawning hole was all there was to be seen. The bottom had dropped out of the trail. John Thornton and Buck looked at each other. "You poor devils," said John Thornton, and Buck licked his hand. So there's a lot of foreshadowing in this chapter. You can see, like, you know that at some point something terrible is going to happen. Buck is saved by John Thornton at the very last moment. Without John Thornton, he would also be under the ice. So what happens is the ice cracks, the sled goes down, which means that all the other dogs died, all the people died, all of their stuff is gone. So there's a lesson here to listen to people who have more wisdom than you, perhaps. Let's hope that for Buck, this is a positive change of fate because he really has suffered terribly under these inexperienced people. Okay, I hope you're enjoying the chapter. This is one of my favorites. Sorry I got so distracted by my little wild thing that I have locked up in a room here because my other wild cat is trying to kill the kitten. So we're acclimating right now. Okay, have a great day. Miss you guys. See you soon.